Have you ever wondered why the simple thought of someone stepping into your private space feels like a disturbance? Why the sound of a knock at the door stirs unease instead of comfort? What seems like mere dislike for visitors is, in truth, a mirror of the soul, a revelation of what lies within the deepest sanctuary of your being. The preference for solitude, expressed through the aversion to visitors, is not a trivial matter of social temperament, but a profound revelation of the orientation of the soul. When a person feels unease or reluctance at the presence of others in their private space, it is not necessarily a defect or a flaw of character, but rather a symbolic declaration that their psyche has chosen a different path of nourishment. Human beings, by nature, oscillate between two currents: the outward pull of society, where one engages in the exchanges of daily life, and the inward pull of silence, where one is drawn into the vast interior landscape of the self. For some, the soul tilts toward the inner dimension, and solitude becomes the natural habitat in which the psyche feels most alive. This inclination is not rooted in misanthropy, but in depth, for within solitude lies the possibility of encountering one's own unconscious, one's hidden layers of thought and feeling that are easily drowned out by the noise of constant interaction. The rejection of visitors, therefore, becomes an unspoken acknowledgement that the individual requires silence as a form of sustenance. Just as some creatures retreat to caves, forests, or the ocean depths to survive and flourish, so too does the human soul sometimes demand retreat into the inner world. In solitude, the boundaries of the self are not constantly disrupted by the presence of others. There is no need to adjust, to mask, or to perform. The psyche is allowed to unfold naturally, without the interference of external energies. This is where dreams are born, where intuition speaks, and where hidden truths rise to the surface. The dislike of visitors reveals that the individual's nourishment comes not from the outer drama of society, but from the quiet dialogue with the self. What others may interpret as coldness or detachment is, in truth, an act of preservation. The soul has chosen silence as a sacred space where its deepest movements can be felt and understood. Visitors, by their very presence, can disrupt this fragile sanctuary, even when their intentions are benign. They carry with them their energies, their emotions, their unspoken expectations, and their unconscious projections. To allow such presences into the personal space is to risk disturbing the delicate balance of inner life. Thus, the avoidance of visitors signals not weakness, but a sensitivity so acute that the psyche defends itself by erecting a natural boundary. It is within this solitude that inner depth matures. Without the constant demands of external interaction, the mind becomes more attuned to subtle impressions, symbolic meanings, and the quiet language of the unconscious. The dislike of visitors is a symbolic expression of the soul's longing for uninterrupted communion with itself. To sit in silence without intrusion is to grant the psyche the freedom to descend into its own depths, to uncover its shadows and its light, to wrestle with its contradictions, and to integrate its hidden fragments into a greater whole. In this way, solitude becomes not an escape from life, but a profound engagement with life at its deepest level, where the presence of others would only serve to obscure the soul's unfolding truth. An aversion to visitors is often misunderstood as a sign of social discomfort or an antisocial tendency. Yet in truth, it can be seen as a profound act of self-preservation, a way in which the psyche protects its own sacred energies. Every individual carries within them a reservoir of psychic vitality, and this energy is not limitless. The soul knows instinctively how to guard and direct it, and the refusal to welcome constant visitors becomes a natural compass guiding the individual toward balance. When one sets firm boundaries against external intrusion, it is not an act of hostility, but of wisdom, for the psyche recognizes that without careful guarding, its strength will be scattered and depleted. Visitors bring with them not only their physical presence, but their emotional weight, their unresolved conflicts, their expectations, and their unconscious projections, all of which can press heavily on the one who has already turned inward for sustenance. The resistance to such intrusion reveals an unspoken law of the soul, that energy must be preserved for what truly matters, for growth, for reflection, for the inner work that cannot unfold in the chaos of constant external demands. Boundaries in this sense are not walls erected out of fear, but thresholds drawn with reverence. They mark the line between what belongs to the self and what belongs to the other, between the private sanctum of the inner life and the public sphere of social obligation. When someone dislikes having visitors, it signals that the psyche has claimed its right to sovereignty, refusing to let its deepest spaces be diluted by the noise of uninvited presence. Such boundaries are not merely psychological but spiritual, for they defend the integrity of the soul's unfolding. The inner world is like a sacred temple. If too many strangers enter, the sanctity is lost. By turning away visitors, one ensures that the temple remains unbroken, that the sacred fire of individuality is kept alive and undisturbed. This preservation of energy allows for authentic growth. Without boundaries, the self becomes overextended, constantly bending to accommodate the needs, moods, and expectations of others. The individual risks losing contact with their inner truth, living more for the gaze of the visitor than for their own unfolding. By choosing not to open the door to every knock, the soul affirms that its growth requires solitude, silence, and selectivity. This is not a denial of human connection, but a refinement of it. For when one does engage, it will be with authenticity and depth, rather than with the scattered fragments of a drained psyche. In this light, the dislike of visitors reveals a soul that has learned the necessity of guarding its sacred energy. It is a subtle wisdom, often misunderstood by those who live entirely outwardly, but profoundly respected by the inner self. The boundary becomes a compass, pointing always toward wholeness, reminding the individual that they are not obligated to scatter themselves in every direction. Their true task is to cultivate the soil of their inner world, and to do that, the sacred space must remain intact, protected, and free from unnecessary intrusion. The home, when shielded from the intrusion of visitors, begins to take on the role of a symbolic temple, a sacred enclosure where the soul feels safe to descend into its own depths. To dislike visitors is not merely a matter of social preference, but a profound expression of the psyche's yearning to guard its inner sanctuary. The walls of one's dwelling mirror the invisible boundaries of the self, enclosing a space where the unconscious can speak freely, where dreams can rise unbroken, and where the fragile process of inner integration can unfold without disturbance. Visitors, no matter how well-intentioned, bring with them the weight of their own energies, their moods, and their unspoken demands. Their presence alters the atmosphere, shifting the subtle balance of the inner space, and for a soul deeply attuned to silence, this disruption feels like a desecration of the temple. Within solitude, the home becomes more than a shelter. It transforms into an inner sanctuary where one communes with hidden aspects of the self. The dislike of visitors reflects a soul that seeks to keep its temple pure, uncontaminated by superficial exchanges or forced courtesies. It reveals a desire to live in authenticity, to engage with reality at a deeper level, without being forced into the masks and performances that often accompany social interactions. In this sense, the home becomes a container for the sacred work of inner life, much like the sanctum of ancient temples where entry was restricted, not because outsiders were despised, but because the sacred required silence, reverence, and protection from casual intrusion. To recognize the home as a temple is to understand the spiritual dimension of solitude. The dislike of visitors signifies not misanthropy, but devotion, a reverence for the inner life that cannot be maintained if the doors are endlessly open. The temple must remain intact for the rituals of the soul to unfold, rituals that involve confronting the shadow, listening to the whispers of the unconscious, and engaging in the delicate process of individuation. When visitors arrive uninvited, they interrupt these sacred rituals, dispersing the concentration of energy that is necessary for genuine transformation. The soul recoils from this interruption, not out of rejection of others, but out of a profound need to preserve the sanctity of the temple within. In the silence of this guarded space, the psyche encounters its dreams, its archetypes, and its hidden truths. The dislike of visitors reflects the awareness that such encounters require seclusion, a protected environment where the soul is not distracted by external chatter or trivial obligations. It is here, in the solitude of the inner temple, that true communion occurs. Communion with the self, with the unconscious, and with the deeper currents of existence. The avoidance of visitors, then, is not avoidance of life, but a deeper embrace of it, for it allows the individual to honor the sacred within, to tend to the eternal fire that flickers at the core of being, and to guard the temple where the soul's most intimate truths can be revealed. A distaste for visitors often arises not from hostility toward people themselves, but from an inner aversion to superficial encounters, for the soul carries an instinctive awareness of the difference between genuine connection and hollow ritual. When someone does not enjoy having visitors, it is usually because the visits are saturated with trivial exchanges, forced politeness, and conversations that skim across the surface of life without ever touching its depth. For a psyche oriented toward authenticity, such encounters feel draining, as if one were expending vital energy on masks and performances rather than on truths that nourish. The dislike of visitors therefore reveals a soul that hungers for depth, for encounters where words are not merely sounds exchanged for social custom, but living bridges to meaning, honesty, and transformation. To sit through small talk when one's inner world is burning with questions, insights, or silence itself feels like a betrayal of the self, and the soul resists by closing its doors to visitors who would demand such shallow rituals. This resistance is not misanthropy, but an acute sensitivity to the quality of human interaction. The psyche knows that every exchange shapes it in subtle ways, and superficial contact leaves behind a residue of emptiness. The dislike of visitors arises because the individual does not wish to be shaped by emptiness, but by authenticity, not by the fleeting drama of appearances, but by encounters that touch the eternal. Visitors, especially when they come with the weight of societal expectation, rarely bring this authenticity. They often bring gossip, chatter, and the obligation to play roles that conceal more than they reveal. The soul recoils, not because it hates others, but because it longs for relationships where masks are discarded, where silence is respected, and where presence itself is enough without the need for endless distraction. There is also a symbolic layer to this aversion, for the shallow visitor represents more than just a person. They represent the forces of triviality and distraction that constantly threaten to invade the sanctuary of the inner life. To dislike visitors is to resist being pulled into the realm of the superficial, where life is measured by appearances and talk rather than by meaning and transformation. The soul's rejection of such encounters shows its allegiance to the deeper path, to the kind of engagement that reveals truth rather than conceals it. The individual who dislikes visitors senses that their own inner work is too important to be diluted by the emptiness of social performance, and so they instinctively guard their time and space. In truth, the distaste for visitors is an affirmation of value. It reveals that the soul does not settle for the shallow comfort of small talk, but seeks relationships that awaken something real, that demand vulnerability, that mirror the hidden depths of the self. Such souls prefer silence over noise, solitude over falsity, depth over surface. They do not wish to waste their energy on hollow gestures, but to reserve it for encounters that are rare, authentic, and transformative. To dislike visitors, then, is not to reject humanity, but to honor it at its highest form, where every meeting becomes sacred because it is real. Choosing solitude as a way of life often reveals the soul's deeper movement toward self-discovery, a path that seeks wholeness rather than distraction. When one feels resistance to having visitors, it is not always a matter of rejecting companionship, but an indication that the inner journey has taken precedence over the outer. Solitude offers a space where the psyche can breathe freely, unencumbered by the constant adjustments demanded by social interaction. In that quiet space, the individual is not required to perform, to mirror others, or to play roles that society has scripted. Instead, they are free to listen to the subtle whispers of their own inner world, to attend to dreams, impulses, and intuitions that cannot be heard amid the noise of continual presence. The dislike of visitors thus reflects the soul's yearning for this uninterrupted dialogue with itself, where the unfolding of the inner life is not compromised by the demands of external company. This path is not one of isolation in the negative sense, but of individuation, a process in which the fragmented parts of the self are slowly drawn together into a greater whole. Visitors, with their expectations and their unconscious projections, often pull the individual away from this delicate task. They ask for attention, for conformity, for energy that must be spent outwardly, while the inner work requires that energy to be turned inward. In solitude, one can confront the shadow, the aspects of the self that are usually hidden beneath the surface, and can learn to integrate them rather than repress them. The rejection of visitors signals that this work cannot be interrupted, that the inner task demands privacy, silence, and consistency of focus. There is also a sacred dimension to the solitary path. Solitude allows the psyche to become a vessel for deeper truths, for archetypal symbols, for images and intuitions that emerge from the unconscious. These experiences are fragile and easily disrupted. A casual visitor, unaware of their weight, can shatter the atmosphere in which these truths rise. Thus, the dislike of visitors becomes a protective instinct, preserving the sacred space where individuation unfolds. The individual is not fleeing from humanity, but is retreating into the sanctuary where they can prepare to meet humanity more authentically once the inner work has ripened. The solitary path also reflects a certain courage, for it requires one to face the self without distraction. Visitors often serve as a way to avoid silence, to avoid seeing what lies beneath the surface. To turn them away is to accept the confrontation with what is hidden, fears, desires, contradictions, and the unacknowledged fragments of the soul. In solitude, these fragments can be seen, embraced, and gradually woven into a unified self. The dislike of visitors, then, is not a rejection of connection, but a step toward deeper connection. For only the one who has faced and integrated their own depths can meet others without distortion. In this sense, solitude is not withdrawal from life, but an immersion into it at its deepest level, where the soul learns to become whole, and from that wholeness it can later meet the world with authenticity. Visitors, in the symbolic language of the psyche, can be understood as archetypes of disruption, forces that break into the protected circle of the self and scatter its concentration. When a person feels discomfort or aversion toward the presence of visitors, it often reflects an inner truth, that their soul is oriented toward continuity of inner flow rather than fragmentation by external interference. Visitors arrive carrying their moods, their expectations, and their unconscious projections, and these subtle influences seep into the environment, altering the psychic atmosphere. For one whose soul is deeply attuned to silence and inner work, such disruptions are not trivial but profound. They interfere with the rhythm of reflection, with the fragile dialogue between the conscious self and the unconscious depths. The dislike of visitors, therefore, is not mere preference, but an expression of a soul protecting its alignment, resisting forces that would scatter its energy outward and dilute its inner concentration. The figure of the visitor symbolizes intrusion. It represents the external world pressing against the door of the inner sanctuary, threatening to collapse the boundaries that separate sacred space from ordinary distraction. This symbolic intrusion is not necessarily hostile. It may come cloaked in politeness or friendship, yet it carries the same effect: the breaking of silence, the shattering of continuity, the forcing of the soul to orient outward when it longs to stay inward. To dislike visitors is to resist this symbolic intrusion, to insist on maintaining the purity of inner time, the unbroken stream of contemplation that allows the psyche to unfold naturally. The visitor disrupts not only physical space but psychic space, and for a sensitive soul, this disruption can feel like being torn away from a task of great importance. In this way, the visitor embodies the archetypal theme of chaos entering order. The inner world, when cultivated through solitude, develops its own harmony, a balance of silence, ritual, and reflection. When a visitor enters, they bring unpredictability, shattering the order and introducing chaos into what was previously harmonious. The dislike of visitors reveals that the individual places higher value on inner order than on social obligation, preferring to protect the harmony of the soul rather than yield to the disruptions of external demands. This instinct reflects a profound truth. The soul knows that its deepest work requires stability, and disruption, however small, can derail the delicate process of integration. It is also important to recognize that the archetype of the visitor is not only external, but internal. The psyche itself is filled with visitors, stray thoughts, intrusive fears, unconscious complexes that disrupt the flow of inner life. The dislike of visitors in the external world mirrors this internal experience, the wish to protect oneself from invasions both outer and inner. By closing the door to external visitors, the soul symbolically declares its need to establish sovereignty over its inner space, to choose when and how it will engage with the world. Thus, the discomfort with visitors is not rejection of life, but protection of inner continuity, the refusal to allow external archetypes of disruption to scatter the soul's path toward integration and wholeness. To dislike having visitors is not a defect, but a profound statement of the soul's orientation. It reveals a preference for silence over noise, authenticity over superficiality, depth over distraction. It shows the natural instinct of the psyche to guard its sacred energy, to preserve the inner temple where dreams, archetypes, and unconscious truths are waiting to unfold. Visitors symbolize intrusion, chaos, and scattering, while solitude symbolizes wholeness, continuity, and the path toward integration. In choosing solitude, the soul chooses growth, not escape. It chooses to listen to its own voice rather than drown in the voices of others. It chooses the sacred over the trivial, the eternal over the temporary. The discomfort with visitors is, therefore, not a rejection of humanity, but a deeper devotion to life itself, for only in protecting the inner sanctuary can one truly encounter the self, and only through the self can one authentically meet the world.